So it's Christmas time, and the wise guys show up. Like Christmas at Tony Soprano's house. Of course, Matthew doesn't call them wise guys. He uses the term Magi. That's the plural of the Greek magus, for those of you that were curious. And the term magus actually covers a lot of territory because it means a sage of the magic religion. It also means astrologer. It also means sorcerer. And kind of down toward the bottom of the list, it can just mean a scholar, a wise man. The term is used 6 times in total in the New Testament. 4 of those times it's by Matthew in this particular passage. The other 2 times it's used, it's in the book of Acts, and it's got very negative connotations there. But here in the context of Matthew, the Magi, the wise guys, they're the good guys. But we don't know much about them. We don't know how many there were. Just that there was more than one, because that's a plural form of the word. We have kind of, over time, written it in as 3 because of the 3 gifts. We don't know where they're from. We just know they're from somewhere out east. Jersey, maybe. We don't know how long they traveled, just that it was a long journey. And we don't even know what their real jobs were. What did it say on their business cards? We just know that they were wise men on this mission. The one thing that we can surmise pretty easily is that they were logical, which maybe goes with being wise. We can say that they were logical because when they saw the sign in the sky and they traveled to the general area where it seemed to be leading them, and they got that far and didn't know where else to go, or what else to do, they did the logical thing. They pulled in at the nearest royal palace, they rolled down the window, and they asked where the new king was. And that tells us that they were logical and wise, I guess. But also they weren't very smart. Because the palace in Jerusalem was the palace of King Herod, and King Herod had a reputation. And it was not a reputation for being an open, friendly, huggable kind of guy. Let's set the table a little bit here. Herod the Great was known in the time as a great builder. If he wasn't actually an architect or an engineer himself, he at least had the vision. He had the ability to see these great things and then have them carried out. The great temple in Jerusalem got a huge upgrade when it was his reign because he expanded the plateau on which it was built and provided even more building space and an even grander structure. He built a great harbor, and he built many palaces, and he built at least one amphitheater. And many, many other public works, so he was definitely the guy when it came to grand, ornate building projects. But he had a little quirk, because he was crazy. In context, again, we can all say that when you're the king of an occupied territory ruling at the pleasure of the Roman emperor, a certain amount of paranoia is healthy. It's probably even a good thing. But Herod had paranoia in spades. And this maybe isn't surprising because Herod gained the throne because he knew when to switch sides. He knew who to kiss up to in the Roman government. But the older he got, the worse Herod got. And by the time we're talking about, somewhere near the end of his life in around 4 BC, his madness was very well known throughout that part of the world. Everybody knew King Herod had some issues. Emperor Caesar Augustus, he was, the census guy. Caesar Augustus was a friend of Herod, and he once said that it was preferable to be Herod's pig than his son, because the pig would live longer. Augustus came to this conclusion toward the end of Herod's reign, because at that point Herod had killed, either by his own hands or by ordering it out, 3 of his sons, Aristobulus, Alexander, and Antipater. He had killed one of his wives, Miriam, and curiously enough, she was the only one he ever really loved. He'd also killed Miriam's mother and an uncle, and many, many others. Not to mention the thousands that died when he was putting down local insurrections. His sons and his wife and his relatives he killed because he thought that they threatened his reign as king. So when you pull into town and you say, hey, we heard that there's a new king around, can you tell us where he might be? That's going to get the homicidal juices flowing if you're Herod. Now, of course, that worked in favor of the wise men, because in this case, Herod then immediately turned around and he started to beat the bushes to find an answer, because he wanted to know where this new threat was coming from. And he called in the scholars, and they told him what they knew. And once he had that information, he called the wise men in and he pointed them toward Bethlehem. But if it worked for the wise men to that extent, it also worked against them, because his plan was to use the wise men to locate the new king so he could be killed. To make a long story at least a little bit shorter, we know that the wise men got to Bethlehem, they asked around, and they found Jesus in a home. And it's not the stable anymore. We know it's a home because the writer of Matthew used the term oikia, not to be confused with IKEA. But oikia means a house or an abode. So they found Jesus at this home, and they walked in, and immediately they began to worship him. And then, according to the Gospel of Matthew, they got out their Thesaurus and they opened it for him. Heard that right? Matthew 2:11. I'm going to read it in Greek for those of you who speak Greek. Hopefully none of you, because I'm going to butcher it. Sike anoigio ho autos thesauros, prospero autodoron Christos, ke Libanos, ke Smyrna. Then, opening their treasure chests, they presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. It turns out that the Greek word Thesaurus, which becomes Thesaurus in Latin, it's only in the last few centuries that that word came to mean a book with synonyms and antonyms, and that was because of a guy named Roger. In the time of Jesus, 2,000 years before that, Thesaurus was a synonym for treasure or treasure chest. Trivia for the day. So they opened their Thesaurus, and they took out the gifts that we know today: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when you look into it, they have written volumes about what these gifts mean symbolically. The traditional one is that they stand for royalty, worship, and death. Gold is royal riches, frankincense is burned during temple ceremonies, and myrrh is a scented spice used back then in the preparation of bodies. But other writers, of course, because it's biblical scholarship, have found other meanings. But there's a more modern interpretation that I found, and it appeals to me. Because there's one way to look at it in which these were not just symbolic gifts, but they were actually very practical. Sort of like giving somebody a toolkit. Because gold and myrrh back at that time were both very expensive. And as we find out when we read a little bit further in Matthew, Jesus' family is warned about Herod, and they flee to Egypt. And they lived there until Herod died, knowing that they were going to be on the run. It would be very useful to have some portable, very valuable objects with them, like gold and myrrh. And frankincense, back then, again 2,000 years ago, was believed to have medicinal value. It was used for a variety of things, like arthritis, for one, and also sometimes as an antibiotic. And that means that frankincense could have been valuable in keeping Mary healthy after the birth of Jesus. Because 2,000 years ago, childbirth was a potentially lethal event for the mother. So it's not necessarily that the wise men knew that these things may have been needed. They may have just brought these gifts because, Jesus wasn't registered anywhere for the baby shower, so they just picked up stuff they thought he could use. These were good gifts for a young king. But it's interesting to think that the way things work out may have caused these Magi to bring exactly what the family was going to need over the next couple of years. Ironically enough, after they put him in danger by visiting Herod. And now, 2,000 years later, we look at these gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and we wonder what meaning they have for us. Or are they just historical curiosities at this point? Is it just Christmas trivia? So here's where we're going to open up the Thesaurus again. And if we open up our Thesaurus today, perhaps we might see that gold is a synonym for the way that we can support the missions of the church financially. It's a way that we can honor God by honoring His church. One way that we can help work toward the kingdom of heaven, that kingdom where people love one another and help one another and try to lift one another up when they're struggling, as Jesus wanted us to do. Maybe gold could stand for that. And then maybe frankincense, which, when it's burned, has this very sweet scent. Maybe that can stand for the sweetness that we enjoy when we worship together. Because 2,000 years ago, frankincense, as this sweet-smelling smoke used in the temple, it was believed to please God as the scent wafted upwards. It was symbolic of the praise and prayers that they shared together then, and it's symbolic of the prayer and praise that we share now and send forth. And certainly it pleases Jesus when we gather in His name and we worship God. That's a pretty good gift. It's an offering of our hearts and our time. And then there's myrrh. Remember, when Jesus died, His followers would have used myrrh and other spices to prepare His body. That was the last gift. It was the last service they thought that they could perform for him. Of course, they were a little bit premature. But their hearts were in the right place. So maybe then when our hearts are in the right place and we want to serve Jesus, that's symbolic of myrrh. Myrrh is symbolic of that. It's symbolic of wanting to perform a service for Jesus, not by preparing his body, but by living out what he's taught us. Not by carrying out a last service for him, but by living out lives of service in his name, using the talents that God gave us. Gold, frankincense, myrrh. Could be synonymous with supporting the church's mission financially, and supporting it with our time, and supporting it with our gifts and our service. So on this second Sunday after Christmas, Epiphany Sunday, I'll leave you with the image of the wise men worshiping and sharing their gifts with the newborn Jesus, these special things that they have brought. And then I'll leave you with a question. When we stand before Jesus ourselves, we open up our treasure chest, what are we offering to him? How are we offering to celebrate Jesus' life? How are we offering to celebrate what he has taught us and the great gift